Half a year ago, I introduced you to Marie Kondō and her KonMari Method. Quite extensively, in fact, we checked out the book, the manga and the Netflix series. Back then we thought, hey, that seems like a nice idea, we should give it a try. And so we did, and today I'd like to share with you our experiences with the KonMari Method. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I'd like to revisit Marie Kondō's KonMari Method and tell you about our experiences with it. First of all, let's briefly summarize what is the KonMari Method all about. One very important factor is that you tidy up in one big one-time major effort. You don't do it in small steps over a long time, but one big major effort. And you tidy by categories, not by places. So you don't do the bedroom first, followed by the living room and so on, but you start with clothes, then you do books and so on by categories. And you follow always the same procedure. First of all, you get all the items together on one big giant pile. You are supposed to take every item into your hands, collect everything, and once you have collected everything, you start by sorting out. So first you figure out what to get rid of. And only once you finished that completely, you proceed to storing things. When you figure out what to get rid of and what to keep, an important question is used. The KonMari method is famous for, does it spark joy? So you take each item into your hands and you see what emotional reaction you have to that item. If you still want it to be a part of your life going forward. So you make an emotional decision rather than rationally justifying why you keep or why you get rid of an item. Now, once you are done with sorting out, you figure out how to store and where to store your items, and there two simple rules apply. Things that belong to the same category should be kept together, and things that have the same owner should also be kept together. The KonMari method emphasizes a positive attitude towards your things, your belongings. For example, Marie Kondō frequently says thanks to the things she discards, thanks them for their services and things like that. And finally, of course, there are lofty promises of all of the great benefits we will get. First of all, this one-time major effort is supposed to really have long-term benefits. So if you tidy up your home properly, that one time it will remain kind of tidy all the way into the future. And it should have a positive impact on your life as a whole. Some clients of Marie Kondō quit their jobs, started an entirely new career, and we are supposed to learn to let things go better and to make decisions better. So we started all of that. We tried to pull it off as closely to the instructions as possible. So we did that one-time major effort. We sticked to the categories and the order as much as possible. We sticked to the basic process of collecting everything, then sorting out, then storing. There were, of course, some deviations in detail. For example, we did not fold our clothing the way Marie Kondō teaches, and in a lot of cases we don't store our things vertically instead of horizontally because our furniture isn't made for that, but we tried to stick to the major points as much as possible. You will notice some more deviations when I describe the individual steps. Of course, we had to split up the big major effort a bit because we don't have a big long section of time in one go. So we did it on individual days over the course of a couple of weeks. We started on June 13th, 2022, and it took us a good 40 days to get finished. Now, the first category is clothes. So we had a look at our clothing. One thing that has always puzzled me in regard to the KonMari method is that you are supposed to have a positive attitude toward your belongings, but then you are supposed to throw everything on the floor. In my home, things usually only go onto the floor if I throw them away right after. So instead of putting stuff on the floor, we put all our clothing onto the bed, and later we usually used this big table here to collect all the things. Clothing did take longer than we expected. My girlfriend and I together spent 4 hours sorting stuff out, but it was certainly worth the effort. There was a big pile of things to sell or discard, and we stumbled upon a lot of old and forgotten things. And this is something that repeated itself in the later steps. So things like, oh, I didn't remember I had this. Yeah, well, this can go away. I don't need that anymore. And it certainly was worth the effort to get rid of those old relics. And sometimes we had to admit to a bad purchase. That we had bought something we thought would be useful or we thought we would like, but then we ended up not wearing it at all for some reasons, and a lot of those we discarded in the end. And this again is something that repeated itself in the later steps. Another interesting effect we noticed is that we sometimes tend to negotiate. Like, oh, I have 3 of this kind of item, well, I will discard 2 and keep 1. Things like that. Right in the first step, I noticed that this spark joy idea sometimes has its limits, at least for me. For example, I had a coat, classic trench coat that I usually wear in spring and in fall. And I didn't like it that much anymore. It didn't spark that much joy. However, if I would have discarded or sold it, I would have had to get a replacement for spring and fall, which would have cost a lot of money, and I was not willing to pay that. So I guess you can totally forego rational considerations when you figure out what to keep and what to get rid of. The second step was books. That was quite a lot of stuff again. This table was quite full with big stacks of books. Primarily my ones, I have to admit, my girlfriend had far less. I have, for example, all the books I purchased for the channel, so it was quite a lot. But it still took less time than the clothes. I guess probably because you don't need to try anything on. But it wasn't that easy, because books have more variety than clothes, because you have novels of different kinds. Then you have non-fiction books about different topics, entirely different topics. Then you have things like comics, manga, art books. Then you have things like cookbooks. So there are totally different kinds of books, and that makes sorting more difficult. And again, Spark Joy wasn't always, didn't always work perfectly well for me. For example, there are some books that I have read, but that I might read again in the future, especially for the channel. I frequently do that. There are some books I haven't read yet, but that I will actually read in the future, because I'm very short on time, and sometimes if I can make the time, I get to read one of those books I've kept for a while. So it's not that simple. The third step is papers, and this was quite a difficult one. We did some work ahead of time before the big paper session. I sorted out magazines, my girlfriend sorted out documents that came by mail that we had kept on a big pile, and this actual paper step was still quite extensive, and we didn't finish everything in detail. We kept some to-dos, and it still took longer than clothes and longer than books. because papers have plenty of subcategories. There are all those documents and contracts and bureaucratic stuff that you have to keep. There are notes and records and materials from trainings, from seminars. There are magazines, comic books, advertising leaflets, brochures, whatever. We even included some stuff I later figured out was not supposed to be in this category, like office supplies, printer paper, envelopes, and so on, or painting and drawing supplies, drawing paper, things like that. So it was quite a lot. And what you noticed here is that the categories and the order proposed by Marie Kondō really make sense, because clothing is a rather distinct category, sharply defined, that is still rather easy. And then you have books where you have more variety, but it still isn't that complicated. And then you have paper where things really get diverse and busy, and really gets more difficult over time in the order she uses. And one new problem we encountered in the paper step were, let's call it, containers. Let's say you've collected all the paper stuff on the table and you have a look at it and you say, oh well, there are 200, maybe 300 things on the table. All right, I can deal with that. Now you take the first item into your hand and you notice it is a binder that contains important documents, and it contains several hundred of those. And now in theory you would have to go through that binder and sort out those several hundred documents. So the effort and the time required kind of explode, and this is an unpleasant effect. So what we did is we didn't go through that binder and other things like it, but we kept it for later as to-dos. We kept some of the kind, like sorting out a collection of certain comics, sorting out collected notes about some event, going through those binders, sorting out outdated and superfluous documents, digitizing some documents where we didn't need the physical one anymore, and so on. Now, one advantage in the paper step is that disposal is rather easy, because you just shred all of them and they go into the paper bin, because selling is rarely an option here. After papers, there is the fourth and the biggest category, which is called Komono, Japanese for miscellaneous. Here, Marie Kondō proposes a number of subcategories. I will display them for you. However, we modified those a bit to better suit our own needs, our own belongings. We made up our own subcategories, and we started with bathroom supplies, all the things like skincare for showering, brushing teeth, whatever. And this one was rather simple, because it basically had two kinds of items. Those we use day by day anyway, that we keep, and those that were old and forgotten, often expired for a long time, that we usually got rid of. And this pretty much repeated in the next subcategory, which was food supplies. There again, we had things we eat almost daily, and things that were forgotten and expired that we got rid of. One interesting phenomenon we encountered here is we noticed that sometimes we had purchased stuff that was actually still in stock, but we didn't know it at the time. And this is something Marie Kondō also mentions in her book. If you don't keep your stuff tidy and organized, you will sometimes end up making unnecessary purchases because you don't really know what you have in stock. Then we proceeded to kitchen utensils, dishes, pots, pans, and so on, things like that. It wasn't that difficult, but here again, this Spark Joy idea had its limits because, especially in the kitchen, you have some things, some appliances that you rarely use, that you maybe haven't used for years, that do nothing but collect dust. But if you look at them and take them in your hands, you think, oh, well, those are actually quite practical and useful. And oh, it was fun back then, 10 years ago. Maybe we should do it again in the future. And yeah, you might end up sticking to things that you better should let go. After that, we proceeded to tools, cleaning supplies, utilities, all the household stuff that's around. This was rather quick and easy again, but even there we stumbled upon old relics, stuff that was still left over from renovating our home several years ago. And one phenomenon we encountered here is that sometimes we have oversized excessive supplies. For example, we rarely used a screw in the last few years, but we had 2 big boxes of screws and similar stuff, and we downsized this a bit. We reduced those supplies a bit. After that, we proceeded to CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, all kinds of data storage devices, excluding games, which was a manageable amount. We don't have that many of those, but it was more difficult than the previous steps, because the previous steps we had things that were where we didn't have a lot of emotional attachment, and of course we are emotionally attached to our music, to our movies, series, and so on. So it was a bit more difficult again. And it got more difficult, especially for me, in the next step, because that was computer and video games, which is somewhat my key topic, my favorite hobby. So the table was quite full of different items, and those items were not just things for me, but they had a lot of feelings and memories and experiences and emotions attached. They were really like small pieces of my life. So this was quite difficult, and it took me about 9 hours to really go through all of them, way longer than for every other category. But it still was worth it. Even there I sorted out some things, so the effort still paid off. After that was another small category. We looked at board games, card games, things like that. Again, we don't have that many of those, so it was rather quick and easy. But we encountered another container because we have some cards from a trading card game, collectible card game, Magic the Gathering. And in theory, we would have to go through all those collectible cards, several hundred, maybe a few thousand, and sort them out. And this would have been a major effort in itself. So again, we kept the to-do for later there. After that, we proceeded to electronics. Here, we didn't really put everything on the table. We, for example, computers, screens, lamps, all of the stuff that is connected, wired somewhere, and that we use daily anyway, we just left alone and didn't really put it all on the big pile. I don't think this did any damage. And it wasn't that much, was a rather easy step again. We encountered the famous collection of cables, but I have to say we were able to figure out what they belong to for most of them. Still, there were some that we got rid of, like generic cables. Let's say you bought a new screen for your computer and you attached it using DisplayPort, but you still keep the HDMI cable that came with it because you never know. And yeah, some of those we threw away. Finally, as the last part of Komono, we dealt with what we called remains. Because up to that point, we had gotten a strong feeling that some things kind of fell through the cracks and were forgotten when we proceeded by categories. So what we did here is we went through all our furniture, we checked all compartments and all drawers, and every compartment or drawer that we hadn't completely cleared out up to that point, we cleared out completely and we cleaned. And all the items we encountered that we hadn't dealt with before, we collected again on the table on the big pile. And there was quite some stuff left over. It took us about 4.5 hours, and we ended up sorting out about 2 big bags of stuff. So this additional step paid off. We encountered things like stuff for the holidays, Christmas, Easter, odds and ends, things like spare earplugs for my earphones, spare light bulbs for the small lamp we have on our bedside, scented candles, placemats for the table, wrapping paper for presents, all those kinds of things. So quite some stuff came together there. After that, we were finished with the big Komono category and proceeded to the 5th and final category, which is mementos, items that we have a strong emotional attachment to. And yeah, this was manageable. It wasn't too much stuff, but it still took a while to go through it, about 4 hours for both of us, because of the emotional attachment. So it wasn't that easy, but it clearly paid off, because what I really noticed here, what I wasn't that aware of before, is that our mementos are kind of random. You know, it's not like the biggest event that was most important to us had the most mementos and so on, but it was more like random. Some event where we had a lot of stuff to hold on to, we had a lot of mementos for, and other events that were maybe way more important to us had no mementos at all, because there were no things at the time to keep. So it had a lot of randomness, and it certainly paid off to go through all of that and to sort it out a bit. So, what was the final result? What were our conclusions? We completed the big major effort on July 24 with the mementos, July 24, 2022. A good 40 days after we had started, and in total, according to my notes, it took us about 44 hours. Now, this is a bit of a rough number. I didn't always remember to check the time ahead and later, so sometimes I had to guess the time a bit, and we were not always both involved all the time. For example, for the games, I did most of that on my own, but just so you have a rough impression of how much time and effort went into it for us. As I said at the beginning, we tried to stick to Marie Kondō's instructions to the method as closely as possible. I think we managed to do fairly well. Now, as you will recall, one thing where we deviated a bit was this issue of containers, where we didn't really take the time to really go into the last detail, sort everything out right away, but we kept some to-dos. I have to admit, some of those we still have after 6 months. Some we have gotten rid of in the meantime. Some we have taken care of, but some still remain because they take a lot of time. And as I mentioned, sometimes we didn't really put everything on the big pile, but left some stuff where it was, when it was clear right from the beginning that we would keep it. For example, stuff we had in our fridge, we didn't take all of that out. Or, as I mentioned before, electronic devices like computer and screens that were connected with a lot of cables. There we didn't make the effort. I don't think it did any harm. So how did we experience the major effort? How did it work out for us? I think every step has clearly been worthwhile. We have sorted out plenty of stuff in every single step. We encountered a lot of old forgotten relics. We encountered a lot of things we hadn't touched since the time we moved into this apartment 6 or 7 years ago. So that was really worth the effort. And we also came across a lot of old makeshift solutions. For example, things that were in a box that was way too big because we didn't have a better fit at hand at the time. Or things that were stored in places that didn't make any sense, but they somehow got stuck there over time. And it really was worthwhile to clean those up. Talking about benefits, I think it had a big and noticeable positive effect. Now, when we move around our apartment, we don't see to-dos everywhere. We don't see stuff we should clear out or take care of. We don't see shelves overflowing and the like anymore. So it really has a positive effect in our day-to-day life. And there are a lot of small simplifications, small matters of comfort and things that are easier now. I found it quite helpful to organize more strictly by category, to keep things of the same kind close together as much as possible. That made things more organized, more tidy in a lot of cases. We have a small storage and pantry that is way more organized and has way more space now. There are some things placed in more sensible locations. For example, I have a small speakerphone, combination of microphone and speaker that I use for online courses in my daily work. And previously it was placed in a bookshelf in the next room because I didn't have room anywhere else. And now it is placed in a drawer right next to where I sit when I work. So it is much easier to take it out in the morning and everything. And we have lots of small improvements like that. Now, we did not turn our life upside down completely. No one quit their jobs, but we didn't really expect that either. But we are still glad we did it. It certainly paid off. Now, difficult question is how sustainable is the benefit? Does this major effort really have the long-term benefit Marie Kondō promises? I'm not sure about that. I guess it's still too easy to tell after just 6 months because obviously you have a lot of positive effects in the time after. For example, since you sort out a lot of things, you have lots of additional space. So if you get new things, buy new things, you have a place to put them, unlike before where everything was overflowing already. And it will take some time until everything is full and overflowing again, obviously. And also we are now taking tidiness more seriously because we recall how much time and effort it took to get everything tidy. So we are more cautious at the moment, but I guess all of this will fade over time. I'm not so sure about those big long-term benefits. Some suggestions from us in case you would like to try the KonMari method as well. First of all, I think it is all right to adjust the categories a bit if it suits your needs. For us, it worked well to change the Komono subcategories. That worked fairly well. And I guess one thing you need to consider is the emotional attachment. For me, the gaming category clearly had the biggest emotional attachment, but since this is Komono, it came pretty far back when we had done a lot of other things before. However, maybe you love fashion, or maybe you have a great passion for books. And in those cases, your most difficult category with the biggest emotional attachment will come very early, so it might make sense to adjust the order in such a case. And I would recommend to also include this remains category we used. It really paid off for us to do that, to go through everything and collect the leftovers. And it would be a good idea to consider in advance how you will deal with those container things. If you will take the time right away to deal with them, in that case you have to plan in a lot of additional time. Or if you will create to-dos like we did, in this case of course it is a matter of discipline. As I said, we haven't taken care of all those to-dos we came up with. So, difficult question. One idea I came up with during the major effort is maybe to consider doing this major effort, this tidying in waves. So you do the major effort, but you already schedule another round in a year or two. Because if you do this major effort for the first time in several years, you will encounter a lot of old relics, a lot of old things you haven't touched for several years. They will quickly create a big pile. Success will really come easy to you. So if you have items that are a bit more difficult, where you need to spend more time considering making a decision, you will usually go easy on them. You will say, oh yeah, well, I've sorted out all the easy stuff. This one is difficult. Well, I will keep it for now. And so it makes sense to come back to it a year or two later and really focus on these problematic cases and really review them. And as I mentioned, sometimes you will do this negotiating stuff like, oh, I have 3, well, I will get rid of 2, I will keep 1. If you revisit it a year or two later, you might have a different view about that remaining one. And especially when you decide how to store things, how to organize things, you will frequently come up with new, supposedly better solutions. And I think it makes sense to also revisit those after a year or two and to check if they really worked well, if they worked as you hoped they would, or if it makes sense to make some adjustments to maybe try something else. Have you ever tried the KonMari method? Please feel free to let me know in the comments about your own experiences with the method and how you liked it. I would also be quite happy about a like, or if you subscribe to the channel. I hope it will spark a lot of joy for you. We will see each other again next week. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.